Alright, in last lecture, we discussed and came up with where the market supply curve actually comes from. And we're going to continue to work with the market supply in the hopes of figuring out what we call equilibrium. So the market supply curve comes from adding up individual firms' marginal cost graphs. So we figured out how to calculate marginal cost. If you remember, marginal revenue we said was the same as price. We calculated average variable cost, average total cost. And what we came up with was that the supply curve was where marginal cost crossed average variable cost and above. So find where the two cross each other, and then up your marginal cost curve. And all of that on each of these individual firms became what we call the supply curve. And so if you'll notice, each of these is upward sloping and to the right. So we're going to draw our supply curve that way. So note that we're still using price and quantity as our labels, and we have a supply curve. The supply curve is upward sloping and to the right because at higher prices, producers are willing to supply more. So if you look back at the previous slide, you will see that at P2, we figure out where that price crosses the supply curve, we will have a quantity. Same with where P1 crosses the supply curve. So we're using similar concepts to what we learned with demand in labeling these quantities. And if we move from P1 to P2, what we're going to see is that the quantity supplied is going to decrease. And vice versa, if we moved from P2 to P1, which would be a higher price, we would see the quantity supplied would increase. So if we think about this from a producer standpoint, if you could get a higher price for your product, would you want to supply more? Yes. So the law of supply states at higher prices, producers want to supply more. A change in quantity supplied results from a price change. So again, this is the same concept when we talked about demand. We talked about a change in quantity demanded and we moved along the demand curve. Now we're talking about a change in quantity supplied, and it results from a movement, results from price change, and it moves us along the supply curve. A change in supply then is a shift in the entire supply schedule. So if we move the entire supply curve, that would be known as a change in supply. So if we move from P1 to P2, what we're going to see is a change in quantity supplied at the bottom. So we moved from one point to another point along our supply curve, and that illustrates a change in quantity supplied. A change in supply moves the entire curve. A rightward shift is an increase, and a leftward shift is a decrease. So here's where we can see, erase this for a minute. Remember I warned you about going up and down. So in demand it worked, but in supply, if you go up, you're going to see a decrease because it would be a leftward shift. So don't do the up and down arrows, go left and right. There are a variety of factors that shift the supply curve, and the first one is the change in the price of other goods. So if we look at substitutes versus substitutes and complements, now this time you're going to have to think like a producer. So the whole goal here is to think like a producer. So if we're looking at change in the price of other goods, what we're going to do is we're going to draw ourselves two graphs, and you should have them on the paper in front of you already, but I'm going to try to make things a little bit neater for us. So we're looking at supply, and let's look at substitutes first. So let's say we look at beef and chicken. So if you look at beef and chicken, very similar to demand, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the original price. Where that hits the supply curve is our original quantity supplied. If we see an increase in the price of beef, so we draw ourselves an increase in the price of beef, what we'll see is an increase in the quantity supplied of beef. If producers are supplying more beef, what's going to happen to the supply of chicken? Well, if all their resources are going towards supplying beef, they're not going to have the resources to supply chicken. So we're going to see a decrease in the supply of chicken. We look at an example of complements. So we looked at peanut butter and jelly. Start with an original price and quantity on the peanut butter line. If the price of peanut butter increases, producers are going to want to supply more peanut butter. And if they're supplying more peanut butter, what are consumers going to use with that peanut butter? Jelly. So then the jelly suppliers will want to supply more jelly. The next supply shifter is the change in the price of an input. So as the price of inputs increases, supply is going to decrease. And what we're looking at here is when we talked about and calculated our marginal costs and our total costs and variable costs, we were looking at input prices. And if it costs more for us to produce something, we're not going to be able to produce as much. So if the price of an input increases, supply is going to decrease. And vice versa. If the price of inputs decreases, we can use more inputs and supply will increase. Technology. If you think about when mass production came about and they created an assembly line, what that allowed was it allowed them to produce cheaper, and it allowed supply to increase. And usually I don't say we're going to go back in time and take away a technology for the supply to decrease. So for the most part, when we talk about technology use, it's going to end up being a supply increase. Change in government constraints. If anyone knows anything about the tobacco industry used to run off of a quota system, and a quota is where you're told specifically how much you're allowed to produce. And so if the government were to remove that constraint and tell the tobacco industry, oh, you can just produce however much you want, what would happen to our supply curve? If you said supply would increase, you are correct. So when they remove a constraint, supply is going to increase. And if they're going to put a constraint on, and for instance say, the dairy industry can only produce so much of this type of milk and so much of this type of milk, what's going to happen is we're going to see a supply decrease. So just like with demand, it's really important to read the scenario and actually understand what they're asking for. And in this case, when we're shifting supply, we need to think like a producer. We need to think like someone who is a supplier. Weather and disease is another supply shifter. If we have really good growing weather, supply will increase. If we have a drought, supply will decrease. This one's pretty straightforward. Disease is the same concept. If there's an increase in disease, we're going to see a decrease in supply. If there's a decrease in diseases, we'll probably see an increase in supply. The number of suppliers, again, pretty straightforward. If there's an increase in the number of suppliers, we're going to see an increase in supply. So if there's people that are jumping into the market, we will probably see an increase in supply. If there's a decrease in the number of suppliers, people are leaving the wheat market and trying to jump into the corn market, we're going to see a decrease in supply. Producer expectations. If producers expect to sell more, they're going to try to supply more. So for instance, if producers are expecting let's say they're expecting prices to be really good the next year for wheat, some people might decide to plant more wheat. And that would be an increase in supply. If producers expect that a new diet fad is going to come about, they might try to supply more. So the pomegranate industry is probably something in recent years that you might be able to think about. 10 years ago people didn't really eat pomegranates, and now they're all over the place and you can buy any sort of pomegranate juice you want. So the goal of this exercise and to figure out supply is really to figure out how we determine price. And what we're, let's put that one. And what we're really looking at is if I have a graph with price and quantity as my graph labels, I can put the demand curve on there, because that's how we drew the demand curve. We had it in relation to prices and quantity. I can also put the supply curve on there, because if you look above, we had supply in relation to price and quantity. So what this means is we want to know, where is price determined? Where are price and quantity set? How do people decide what price that they're going to sell things for? In a perfect world, in a free world, we would determine price where supply equals demand. So where our two lines cross, we would put a nice big dot. And if we draw a dotted line to the left and label that as price, that would be where we set price. If we draw our line down, that would be where quantity is set. We call this equilibrium. And it's where supply equals demand. And so what we're going to do over the course of the next several worksheets is we're going to look at what happens to price and quantity when there are factors out in the market that cause supply or demand to shift. So if, for instance, we have really good growing weather in the corn market, and we see an increase in supply, what happens now is I have a new supply curve, which means I have a new equilibrium point. So where my red supply curve, or S2, crosses my demand curve, is my new equilibrium point. And that gives me a new price and a new quantity. And we can see that if supply increases, we'll have a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. So, ways to label this. These definitely have to be here. This price, P1 and P2 and Q1 and Q2. Obviously the P and Q labels and my supply and demand labels. I like seeing arrows. As a teacher, that really helps me out. But if you have the 1 and the 2 on there for the price and the quantity, that'll definitely let me know where you're going. Using different colors at this point in the semester will also help, so you can see where you started out and where you're ending up. So let's look at another one of those. Oops. It will also help out if before you make any changes to your graph that you put your original price and quantity in. Now, I've noticed that students that really struggle here definitely try to label everything at the end. Don't do that. Label as you go. It'll help when we're looking at changes. Remember how I said in the demand lecture that I was going to prove that we actually create that increase in price of gas? So if consumers expect the price of gas to go up, what they're going to do is the current demand for gas is going to increase because we're all going to go out and fill up our cars. So if the current demand for gas increases, it's a shift in the demand curve. What that does is we now have a new equilibrium point, and we see a higher price and more quantity. So what you're going to do now is you're going to do some worksheets and work on shifting the supply and the demand curve. The first worksheet, you'll only shift one or the other. And then we're going to look at shifting both the supply and demand curve. And I have some YouTube clips that will help with that, but I'm going to do one here really quick just to show you what happens, because it's not straightforward if both curves move. So pay close attention, because this one tends to lose some students. So we have an original supply and demand curve, and what I'm going to say is, let's say we have some really good growing weather, so we'll see an increase in supply, and consumers expect the price to go up. or there's an increase in population. So we also see a demand increase. So this is where, why did my supply increase not go on there? And we're having issues. Oh, it did. Never mind. Okay. So we have where the two red lines cross each other, or where S2 and D2 crosses, we have a new equilibrium point and a new quantity. However, if I draw my line back to the price, it kind of looks like price stays the same. Ugh, that's a little scary, isn't it? Is that really what's going to happen? Is price really going to stay the same? Probably not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a different increase in demand. So this blue line also illustrates an increase in demand where it crosses the red. I'm showing a decrease in price, still showing an increase in quantity. That hasn't changed. And let's draw a really big increase in demand. So where that line crosses, I can show an increase in price. So what this is telling us is that when we're looking at it theoretically, we're seeing, or we're not having a magnitude be real numbers. So I can't tell you, given the scenario that income increases or population increases, I can't tell you where that demand curve is. It could be D2, D3, or D4. And so what that means is, alls I really can say is that no matter what, in this scenario, quantity is going to increase. Because no matter what happened, I was always to the right of where Q1 is. However, I showed that price could go up, price could go down, or price could stay the same. So we're going to say that price is a question mark, or label it as unknown. Anytime you shift both supply and demand, one of them will be unknown. Either price or quantity will be unknown. Anytime you shift both supply and demand, one of them will be unknown. So what you're going to have to do is look at, if you use graph paper, it'll make it a little easier. If you can do your shifts the exact same so it looks like price stays the same, we know that's not going to happen, and we can definitely go from there to say price is unknown. But if you draw your graphs and it looks like price increases and quantity increases, you're going to say to yourself, nope, when I shift both, one of them's got to be unknown. So what that means is that you need to take one of those curves, your demand curve or your supply curve, and move it a couple more times to see if you can make price go up and down or stay the same, to be able to find out which one is going to be the unknown factor. So unless we know specific numbers on the magnitude of the shift, we'll only be able to say for sure that quantity increases. And we just have to say and show that price is unknown. So again, your first worksheet is going to look at shifting either supply or demand, and in that case you will definitely be able to tell me what happens to both. But then the second worksheet is going to look at shifting both supply and demand, and you will need to be able to figure out which price or quantity is going to end up being unknown.